Hi, y'all. The purpose of this lecture will be to essentially take us from the end of the French Revolution through Napoleon. It's actually the last thing that I'll record lecture-wise for this unit, and it's going to be the type of thing that we'll kind of do a couple slides on it in class, then talk about some things involving Napoleon, et cetera, then do another slide, then talk about some things involving Latin America and Napoleon, then do a final slide, stuff like that. So although I'm going to put this all together on one video, I'll tell you hey, we'd stop here at the first time or stuff like that in case you miss a part or something along those lines. Okay, so that gives you an idea of basically how this thing will work. I said it was basically going to take us from the end of the French Revolution all the way through Napoleon. And before I actually get to the man himself, I need to just spend one slide on basically what happens once we finish the video and stuff like that. Because you remember last time we were in France, we finished the video on the French Revolution. Robespierre had, tried to commit suicide, failed at that, and then been guillotined. And then after that, we started talking about Haiti and the end results there, and kind of looking at the revolutions and talking about whether revolutions could be bloodless or something like this. So this first slide will basically take you from the end of Thermidor 9, which is when Robespierre and the people along those lines. And his cronies were not the people along those lines. Robespierre and his cronies were finally taken down and executed. The Reign of Terror pretty much dismantles itself. Some members are arrested. The committees are closed. Most jails are emptied. Amnesty is extended to most people, with the exception of the sans-culottes. Many of them are actually executed. They have been some of the bloodiest, most violent, extrajudicial, and I don't even mean extrajudicial in the sense of the Committee on Public Safety. They were even outside that farcical judicial thing, right? So many of those were actually executed. The committees closed. Jacobin, Girondin clubs closed, etc., etc. We have something called the White Terror that actually ensues after this, right? And the White Terror is this period where there are all sorts of accidental deaths against people who were actually not executed. So people who had amnesty extended to them, like Key, Jacobin, Girondins, etc., who weren't actually executed. It's the type of thing where all of a sudden they'd be like, "Oh man, he just got really drunk and fell to his death. That's a shame. That must have been a huge, shameful accident. Darn." And everybody'd be like, "Darn." And so there'd be deaths, assassinations with no real, actual, consequences in any way whatsoever, right? And during this whole time, France is being ruled by a directory, which is a five-man oligarchy, okay? An executive made up of a group of bourgeoisie. They've got a new constitution and a two-house legislature, but they can do pretty much absolutely nothing, and they have very little power. And that makes them really, really, really popular with the lowest classes because they need stability, and this gives stability, and it puts food on the table for the people that need it the most. They're continually worried about royalist resurgence, and because they're trying to be centrist, they don't actually make any hardcore decisions and upset people on both sides. So it's really a kind of ineffective 5 years or so. But the directory, proper noun directory, is the official name for the government during this time. Okay, so in the background of all this, enter this man right here, Napoleon. That's him on the right, that's him in the center. That's actually, just to be clear, not him on the left. That's actually a statue of his arch nemesis, the one person that he couldn't beat on a regular basis, Admiral Horatio Nelson of Great Britain. But Napoleon had actually been quite popular prior to his rise to power and stuff like that. He'd been involved in the wars. He's won some key battles when France was fighting Austria in the French Revolution. And he's actually a really, really, really popular general when the directory is having all sorts of problems and stuff like that. Okay, we'll get back to the directory in a second, but let's focus on this guy for a little bit, because regardless of not, and no pun intended when I said for a little bit on that, but regardless or not of whether or not he had a massive direct effect. He didn't conquer Europe or anything like that. Napoleon had such a major long-term effect on Europe that he deserves a little bit of commentary in and of himself. Okay, what I'm going to basically be arguing to you over the course of this is that, there was a huge mess left by the Reign of Terror, right? And the Thermidorian reaction and all of that caused, and that's what we call, the Reign of Terror is the first part. The Thermidorian reaction is taking down Robespierre and all those guys, and then we've got that Directory and the White Terror and all that crap. Anyway, that caused the people of France to basically be like, you know what, we will accept any type of rule that is possibly okay as long as the violence stops. Okay, it had been such a problem for so long, and the French Revolution is what I always tell kids is the ultimate. And when you have like no protection and supposedly all sorts of freedoms, because then all hell breaks loose and stuff like that, and the government can do what they want, and there's not anything in place, and blah blah blah. And so they really were like, you know what, we really don't care. We would honestly take, like Bozo the Clown as like, king, as long as he could just make like heads like stop being cut off at this point, right? And this led to a weak government directory that I've talked about that did absolutely nothing. And while that was popular at first, there's no way a weak government was going to stand in what had been the strongest centralized absolute monarchy in Europe prior to this. I mean, like, we might make fun of France as like, not being a like decisive dominant power today, or like not having an army or stuff like that, and that really is a stereotype that comes out of World War II. France was always considered to be one of the strongest. It was always the most dominant land power in Europe, etc., etc. It had a strong central monarchy. It had like, powerful leaders, not necessarily tons of rights for its citizens, etc., etc. And there's no way that that's just going to sit there without like with the directory, right? That's not what's in the spirit of France or stuff like that. And so Napoleon Bonaparte is able to capitalize on this really hardcore, and he's going to open. He's going to see an opening. He's going to start to swing people away from radical democracy, and he's just going to kind of slowly move towards like yet another absolute monarchy, which the people of France are willing to accept again at this point because they've had so many problems with democracy, or what their form of democracy in the French Revolution and stuff along those lines. Okay, so Napoleon's a big enough figure. Most of you guys have heard of him before, at least in history. That is a big enough figure in history. Most of you guys have heard of him before. That I would have really just begun with, like, what do you know about Napoleon? But since we're doing this thing virtually, there's really no way to do that. I'm just going to kind of start talking about him. First of all, the first thing you should know about him, he's not French. He's actually Corsican, which is an island run by France off the coast of France. He's probably the only really famous Corsican in history. Like, if you're ever playing trivia and, like, it begins with, like, what famous Corsican, just, like, raise your hand and immediately guess Napoleon. You've got a 99% chance of being correct, and if you don't, it's a reasonable thing. You can apologize to everybody for at that point. He's historically famous for being really short, which is only kind of true, and I've been subtly making short jokes throughout the course of this. For those of you that haven't noticed, please try to pay attention further on and like listen, because I'm not going to stop in any way whatsoever. But the thing is they measured inches a little bit differently than they used imperial inches. So like when you hear that Napoleon was like 5 feet or 5'1" or maybe even 5'2", he's actually more like 5'6", 5'7", which is shorter than me, so I'm going to make fun of it for sure. But is not, overly short for that time, especially given like health or stuff along those lines. And by that I mean nutrition, like people getting like the food, the vitamins, the minerals they needed, etc., etc. The reason that he's known for being super short is British propaganda. Napoleon had this obsession with beating England, something he could never do, and England is going to relish every minute of the fact he cannot do it, up one side and down the other, and permits all sorts of propaganda against him, blah, 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 blah. And so that was one of the things that was put forward, right? He's lieutenant by age 16. He's generally considered by most people one of, if not the greatest general in the history of the world. He's loved by his men. He's supported in both his tactics as well as like, his ability to go out in the field and get people riled up, as well as like, his ability to like force people and the army to do what he wants. I mean, one of Napoleon's famous quotes is, "You can't beat me. I spend 30,000 men a day," which isn't really true, but is a point that he was willing to do, and he was willing to push forward, that nobody else was willing to do. He used the military in a way that the military had never been used before prior to this time, right? And he becomes a hero of the revolution when he defends the delegates of the National Assembly against a royalist attack. This is like right before the directories come up, and he's able to defend the assembly, and everybody's like, "Hey, long live Napoleon," blah, blah, blah. And he's not dumb. He capitalizes on this at this point, and he uses the fact that he's able to defend the assembly at this point, not to take power or anything like that, but to become even more popular. He's going to invade a part of Italy which has Austria, kind of on the border of Italy and France, and then Austria is kind of over towards the other side and around Switzerland there and stuff like that. And he's going to invade down in that area, and he's going to be fairly successful. But he's going to be really popular because once he's done this, he actually invades once he's invaded the northern Italy Italians, he charges them for the invasion. He turns around and taxes them to pay for the invasion rather than France. So France gains territory and prestige that it thought it had lost during the French Revolution without having to spend an ounce of money, right? And you can see how popular he is because after this he goes to Egypt and he gets into a fight. This is the first of a couple losses where he's going to lose to Admiral Horatio Nelson, his nemesis that I mentioned earlier, at something called the Battle of the Nile. Despite the fact that he gets his butt kicked, he's able to slip the blockade, get back to France, and before it becomes like a major news, he's actually able to like woo, bribe, and threaten, a combination of all three if we're being honest, the French papers to make sure that it never really makes major news in France. So like what you see Napoleon early is that he's super popular and he's super well he's good at like making sure and honing that popularity, if that makes sense. As Napoleon comes back, and we hit right around the turn of the 19th century, right around the beginning of like 1799, 1800 area, right at that point, the Directory's been in power right around 5 years or so. The Neo-Jacobins, these are people that like want to bring back the terror and the French Revolution and stuff like that, become a really serious threat, and Napoleon defends the Directory against them a couple times, and it looks like France might descend into violence again, and it's at this point that like Napoleon's friends urge him to seize power. And when he's in the process of defending the Directory, he like walks into the Directory afterwards, and he's like, you know what, you guys really can't handle yourself, so I'm going to do this. And the Directory does one of the most comical things in legislative history, which is it then votes to abolish itself. All five of them vote to abolish itself. And then they form a three-person consulate. They make Napoleon Bonaparte the first consul, and eventually he gets rid of the other two and becomes dictator. This is known as something that's known as the Brumaire coup. Much like we had the Thermidorian reaction or Thermidor 9, the French Revolution, we're still on the French Revolution calendar, and so this occurs in November of 1799, and the French name for the Revolution's calendar name for November at that point is Brumaire, so this becomes known as the Brumaire coup. This next painting is actually one of the most famous paintings in history. It's by Jacques-Louis David, and it's called The Coronation of Napoleon. And it's huge. It's actually like the size of almost one of like those block walls at school, if you can imagine this. There are a few copies of it. One of them at Versailles. If you've been there, you've seen it. It's also, there's one at the Louvre as well. And so you can see the whole painting as a whole on the top right. And the bottom left is a cutout of the painting. And I bring this up because I talked about Napoleon just seizing power, right? And this is known as the Coronation of Napoleon. And throughout history at this point, what had happened is that the Pope had always come in to crown the king. Okay, this was why the Pope always argued he was higher than the king, the church was higher than the state, etc., etc. But God chose the king, and the Pope was, God's messenger on earth, so the Pope came to crown the king. And the way the story goes right here, and that's what you see at this moment, is it's at this point that the Pope goes to crown Napoleon, Emperor of France, right? Napoleon takes the crown from the Pope's hand and puts it on his own head, as if to say, like, you know what, you don't get to crown Napoleon, only Napoleon crowns Napoleon. And I bring this up because not only does it give you the idea of the pomp and circumstance as well as the power and dominance that Napoleon wanted and needed to have in order to be able to rule France, but it also, I would argue, represents the final like squashing of the power between the church and the state, particularly in Western Europe. Like, there will be no time after this where any monarch will have to be crowned by like a pope. It will only be to hold up like ceremony or pomp and circumstance or stuff along those lines. And like as Napoleon's about to do, he's going to get the church out of like French politics like pretty much forever, if that makes sense. And so this is like, a painting that really is kind of representative of that as we talk about some of the like both positive and negative things that come out of Napoleon. This brings us to actually the first part where we'd stop in class and talk about it. And so if you miss like, just the first part of the day, you can stop here. The rest of the lecture will come a bit later and stuff like that. But what we're going to do at this point in class, we're going to take out our Spielvogel books from 587 to 590. There's this great Monty Python skit, if you've ever seen Monty Python's Life of Brian, entitled, "What Have the Romans Ever Done for Us?" And these people are rebelling against Rome, and somebody is complaining, and they say, what have the Romans ever done for us? And somebody says, well, they gave us the aqueduct. And then somebody else says, well, they gave us cleaner city streets. Well, they gave us, public education. They gave us the roads, stuff like that. And finally, they get to the end, and they're like, okay, aside from the aqueducts, public educations, cleaner city streets, city walls, police force, firefighter, public safety, a school system. What have the Romans ever done for us? And then that's finally where they say nothing. And I like to make the same type of point with Napoleon because Napoleon does get a fairly bad rap in history from time to time, sometimes as a monarchical tyrant who wants to take over Europe. But he actually did a lot of really positive things, both in and outside of France at the same time. We should note both the positive and negative. So your job right now at this point will be to read the pages and make a list of what has Napoleon ever done for us. And once we have done that in class, I will go ahead and post that on Canvas as well. And then if you were able to do this part in class, I'll get to the second part of the lecture in 1 second. Okay, so as you can see on Canvas, and as we'll talk about in the slide for a couple seconds, and not as long as we would have with some of the stuff in class, that I'll also post up the list we made in class on Canvas. Napoleon was actually really rational and did a bunch of really good things for France. The first thing he did, I'm not necessarily sure we'd call that a good thing or not, but we should be aware of this. The first thing he does is he holds something called a plebiscite to approve a new constitution and make him leader. And the thing essentially says, it's, a vote that says, like, who should lead France? And your options are like 1, Napoleon, or 2, like, and there's not even an option for other. It's just like a blank thing, right? And so, like, it's one of those that, like, he says, oh, well, you guys all voted for me and you all voted for this new constitution. For now, I can legitimately claim power, first as president and then as emperor of France. And you saw the thing with him being claimed, or eventually being crowned emperor of France. He's going to keep a bunch of changes from the revolution. He's going to bring the calendar back, some of that stuff that's kind of, he thinks is a bit ridiculous, but he's going to keep the church out of the state by signing something known as the Concordat. The Concordat is an agreement with the Pope in which Napoleon basically says, hey, look, the French French people and French government will remain nominally Catholic as long as you promise to stay out of the government and the church exerts no power over the government. Sorry, I got a little bit muddled there for a second. The church, which is losing people like crazy thanks to the Enlightenment and trying really hard to keep, one of the key nations in Europe under its belt, is more than happy to make that deal and basically say, okay, France is Catholic from now on, but no government or control, government or control by the church. Meanwhile, at the same time, Napoleon is going to do things like clean up corruption. He's going to set up like tax collection and have the first like reasonable system of taxes in France for, I don't know, about 500 years or so. And actually have people enforce it. He's going to create banking systems that the government backs to a certain extent. He's going to establish public schools. He actually becomes so popular that in my screwing around through primary sources about 10 years ago, I actually came across this primary source entitled, like, Why Napoleon is the Jewish Messiah. Now, I think that's a little bit... yes, comical and overdone and stuff along those lines, but it gives you an idea of how popular he became in France at this point. And one of the reasons, too, was while he did say the Concordat, France would remain Catholic, etc., he did allow freedom of religion. France is actually the first major country with complete and total Jewish emancipation in Europe, which means Jews are given the same rights as Christians, the ability to be citizens, the ability to appear in court, stuff along those lines. He sets up the Napoleonic Code, which is still the basis for laws in France today, as well as in other parts of Europe, because as Napoleon is going to conquer Europe, he's going to bring a number of these things in. And Napoleon, for example, is going to modernize Spain in a way that, Spain had not been modernized in about 400 years or so. A lot of these things in dress injustices, peasants now have rights. They actually have equal rights in court as, nobles. It's not just the word of a noble over the word of a peasant. But we should keep in mind that Napoleonic Code, unlike, say, Anglo-American law or something along those lines, generally chooses absolutism and hard power and protects the rights of police more than it does the other people. I know that might sound comical given the things that we've had in this country recently, where police violence and brutality and protecting the rights of police, but it actually is it is significantly easier to challenge that under Anglo-American law than it is under Napoleonic Code, which is the basis for most of European law today, if that makes sense. And then Napoleon decides that he really needs to cement his legacy and rule all of Europe. And I like this picture because it really gives you an idea of Napoleon trying to look like a Caesar. I mean, I really feel like he's gone off the deep end and become like the real hardcore emperor of Europe. One of the best ways to separate out Napoleon at this point is his relationship with his wife, which I'm going to talk about for 1 second. Because originally Napoleon is married to Josephine, and Josephine and Napoleon actually, well, depending on the sources you read, is debatable, but the traditional idea is that they get along fairly well and that she helps him and advises him and stuff like that. Whether or not they get along well or not is not the important thing. The important thing is once he becomes emperor and once he becomes not even just president, but dictator or consul or whatever the heck he wants to call it at the beginning. But once he becomes actually emperor, he's like, nope, I need royal blood and I need my kids to be emperors. So he divorces his wife, Josephine. He marries a Habsburg, which is one of the most noble and ancient royal families in Europe, solely so that his kids will be Habsburgs, even though he can't stand this woman, etc., etc., and they really kind of hate each other. And this is an example of Napoleon being like, okay, maybe this isn't about the revolution or the republic. Maybe this has become about me and power and government and not government, and military and might and stuff along those lines. And so Napoleon begins by starting an empire, and he really determines that he's going to try to rule most of Europe. And as you're going to see throughout the course of this, and please do not ever sit here and write down and memorize the various sides of the Napoleonic Wars, okay? You get a ton of them. You get the wars of the 1st through 6th coalition, okay? I'm never going to ask you, what was the key battle of the War of the 6th Coalition? No, that's not how Dorn operates by any means whatsoever, right? Okay, so when I sit here and say here's what he's doing, get the idea that he's taking over large things, and that's the point. The big thing is going to be this. What you want to keep in the back of your mind is balance of power, because we talked about that, and I had to talk about that theory so it would come up later. During the French Revolution, we saw Austria and Britain and other places try to eat at France because they had been powerful for so long, and try to change the balance of power, and large parts of the Napoleonic Wars are going to be about maintaining the balance of power in Europe. Okay, now the first thing Napoleon does, and this is important mainly for the long-term safety of the United States and also kind of changes the world, is he's in a crunch for cash. So he actually sells Louisiana Territory. If you've ever heard of the Louisiana Purchase, this gives you an idea of where we are in time, to Jefferson and the Americans for about $15 million, which ends up being one of the greatest land deals in history. It's like pennies on the acre. But Napoleon raises a lot of his cash this way. He also tries to sell Haiti as well, until he remembers that, oh wait, Haiti's actually revolted and isn't really under my control. So that's mostly lost on people. He resolves to deal with that later, as we talked about when we talked about Napoleon and the Haitian Revolution a little bit a couple days ago or so. So now he's gotten some cash together and stuff like that, and he already had part of Italy, and he's going to annex the rest of Italy, part of Austria, and Slovenia from campaigns before. And thanks to marital ties, this goes back to the Habsburgs, that they ruled Austria, but they also actually ruled Spain, and at times they actually even ruled Mexico, but that's another story for later on, as well as the Netherlands, as well as Belgium, and numerous other countries we don't even need to mention. So eventually he's able to annex the Austrian Netherlands, which is Belgium or so, take Italy, control Switzerland in everything but name, right? Switzerland is technically neutral, but there's a lot of influence there. And Napoleon basically pushes east across the German Straits towards Austria and Prussia. And he's really, really successful, if you can think on a map, as he pushes from France kind of east across Europe, okay? He's really successful that way, okay? He's going to push west as well into Spain, but we're not there quite yet, okay? When he turns around the other way and tries to deal with Britain in his early empire, he's nowhere near as successful. Napoleon is absolutely obsessed with Britain. Some of this probably has to do with the fact that he can't seem to beat them, particularly Nelson in a war. Some of it has to do with the fact that, they got themselves together in a way the rest of the continent didn't governmentally earlier and stuff like that, so there's some envy and stuff along those lines. A large part of it also has to do with the fact that, Britain, having gotten themselves together, is in the process of going around and colonizing, conquering the world, and Napoleon sees that as something he'd like to do as well. So he creates something called the Continental System, where basically Napoleon is going to use his conquest, and then he's also going to turn around and ally. If he doesn't conquer all of Prussia, he'll ally with the rest of Prussia, and stuff along those lines. to basically try to blockade Britain and starve Britain out so that Britain has no friends, no allies, nobody to trade with. This ends up backfiring way, way, way more than it is successful for Napoleon because Britain instead begins using its colonies for trade and it starts looking other places. So, for example, when it starts to run out because, the American colonies are broken away and it's starting to run out of cotton, that's when they're going to get into and, put their hands into Egypt and get into, the Egyptian cotton and the stuff that Britain would want there. And so it actually pushes Britain to take over other parts of the world and then trade that way in ways they probably wouldn't. Napoleon chases around the British for a while, and finally they meet in a battle that he's not involved in because it's a naval battle. It's off the coast of Spain. It's known as the Battle of Trafalgar. And here, in a really bold move that we won't get into, known as crossing the T, Napoleon's navy is crushed by Horatio Nelson for the final time. Nelson actually dies in the battle. It's one of those legendary battles in England, or it's one of those legendary battles in British history. If you've ever been to London, you've probably walked through one of the main swaths of London known as Trafalgar Square, named after that with Nelson at the top. I'll show you pictures in a second. It's really important because it assures that Napoleon's never going to be a serious threat to conquer and invade Britain. And it also ensures that Britain's going to be able to dominate the Navy for the next, 100 plus years or so. These are pictures from Trafalgar Square right here. You can see the top part, the column right here with Horatio Nelson up top, and then there's also a nice fountain. And if you go to right down here, you'll run into Big Ben and the Houses of Parliament, and on the backside is the National Gallery and stuff like that. Both Trafalgar Square and Waterloo Station are named after events from the Napoleonic Wars, which I think gives you a really good idea of how important the Napoleonic Wars were to the psyche of the British and Britain at that time. Okay, so Napoleon's been really, really, really successful in the East. Not so successful fighting Britain. And his next move is to move really in the only place west that he could, which is to move on Iberia, which is Spain and Portugal, okay? And this is the beginning of the Peninsular War. And this is the last part of what we're going to do for the second part of Napoleon, because after this we're going to move over to Latin America, and we're going to look at the revolutions that occur in Latin America, because I'll be, it says it on this slide, but I'll be really direct here. When Napoleon conquers Spain and Portugal, the people who exist in New Spain and Brazil sit there and say, well, shoot, I barely had any allegiance to Spain at this point. I definitely don't have any allegiance to frickin' Napoleon. Screw that. It's time to rebel. So, the Peninsular War and Napoleon's successful invasion and conquest of Spain is directly what leads to every single part of Spanish and Portuguese America, with the exception of Cuba, being free of Iberian control by 1830. This is directly linked to Napoleon. Okay, so in 1870, marches on Spain. He moves on Iberia, and he actually brings massive reforms to the people, reforming the tax system, as I said, taking Spain out of debt. But the problem is he really underestimates nationalism and the fact that people don't like to be conquered. Okay, and he loses more popularity when he makes his brother the King of Spain, because that really makes, they're like, okay, you just got rid of the royal family, you might be doing some good things, but, we're not Spano-French or Frencho-Spanish, we're Spanish. And so this idea of, okay, you might be doing things, but people don't like to be conquered, becomes a really, really, really big idea in Spain. And this causes people, both Creoles, most particularly, Creoles who feel way more allegiance to, the countries they are growing up in Latin America rather than Spain, where their, parents' were from, but also Peninsulars to, literally be we don't have a direct tie to these anymore. And so, in the name of popular sovereignty, this is going to lead to a number of uprisings in Latin America. Once he's done with Spain, Napoleon's actually going to march on Lisbon. And he's going to get right outside the gates of Lisbon, and one of the greatest trivia questions in all of world history, the oldest peace treaty in the world actually exists between Portugal and Great Britain. It goes back to about the 1200s or so, and invoking that treaty, the British actually helped the Portuguese court, the entire Portuguese court, abscond and relocate to Rio de Janeiro, where they stay for the next 30 plus years. As a matter of fact, once Napoleon's gone, the Brazilians or the Portuguese are like, hey, you guys want to come back? And the Portuguese royal family's like, no, we actually kind of like it in Rio better, and they end up even having a whole branch in Rio, and Brazil ends up with an emperor for a little bit, and then stuff along these lines. Okay, so actually, hold on, one more thing. I just felt like I should show you this famous painting that goes with Goya's 5th of May here, which is like the invasion of Napoleon in the Iberian Peninsula, and you can see this was used to bring up nationalism, and it shows French troops executing or firing on innocent Spanish revolutionaries at the time, and this gives you an idea of okay, things were doing well and things were going okay, as far as instituting the reforms Napoleon thought the people would like, but again they didn't like to be conquered, and so you're going to get nationalist paintings and styles like this. To show that aspect of it, if that makes sense. Okay, this is where we're going to stop for the second part or so. We're going to spend the next few days looking at the revolutions in Latin America, how that happened, the end result, etc., etc. I'm going to keep this going, and I'm going to talk about the beginning of the end, but for those of you that missed the second part of the lecture, this is it. The third part will start when we talk about the beginning of the end in 1 second here. By the way, before I get started, I realized that last slide I showed you, it's not Goya's 5th of May, it's Goya's 3rd of May. I realized it didn't sound right because I was like, wait, the painting is not the same as Cinco de Mayo, but yeah, so the painting's name is the 3rd of May. Sorry about that. It's still about Spanish nationalism and the other stuff I said, but I just got a bit muddled there. All right, this is the last part about Napoleon, and this is the final kind of Napoleon at the end part that we'll talk about for those of you that are listening to this lecture slightly asynchronously or so. And after Napoleon has invaded Iberia, eventually he's going to get rebellions, and not him, he'll be gone by then, but rebellions in parts of Latin America. He's going to have some dealings with Haiti and stuff along those lines. But his big mistake is having been really successful in the East and having had a number of conquests and or allies. Napoleon decides that he's going to invade Russia. Okay, and his plan is that if he starts this in the summer, so first thing you should know about invading Russia is there's a really short window to fight. Really short window to fight. You've got this wet season in the spring where you can barely move troops. You've got a freezing / cold season in the winter. Actually, you can move troops really easily in the cold season because everything's frozen over and you just plow right over them. But then you've got more in the fall when things are in the process of freezing. It's wet and cold as well. You can't move troops. You got a really short. I mean, it's like painting in Seattle where you've got 3 months out of the summer where you can actually paint. It's not quite at that level, but fighting in Russia, fighting wars is a really short time to do it without getting your butt completely kicked. And by the way, let's note the minute that it starts changing, everything favors the Russians. Okay, so Napoleon's plan is that he's going to invade in June of 1812. He's going to use Vilnius in Lithuania as his base. And at that point, he's going to create this massively large supply chain where he's just going to, go be able to take troops from Vilnius on and give supplies and stuff like that. In order to avoid doing that, that's what would have to happen in order to get into Russia, have this massively long supply chain from Vilnius on, right? He plans that once that supply chain leaves and he can't get there anymore, that he's just going to live off the land. That Russia's got a bunch of land there and stuff like that. That it's big. That he can support his troops, etc., etc. And knowing that, the Russians go into something called scorched earth policy, and they burn it. Basically, Tsar Alexander I decides, you know what, I can't beat Napoleon's army flat out, but I can burn down everything and starve it to death. And so instead of trying to face them in the field, what he does was he burns Moscow, and then he runs backwards. And so Napoleon gets into Moscow in October, September or so, ready to winter here, live off the land, not have to worry about a supply chain because everything's frozen, etc., etc., and he's a long way from Vilnius by now, and blah, 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 only to find nothing. No food, barely any water, no shelter. The whole thing is completely turned down. Meanwhile, the Russians have run a little bit behind it. They have dug in, they are fortified, and they are ready to attack. Realizing that his army is going to freeze to death, Napoleon starts in October to turn around. And it's at this point as they turn around, they get caught in the winter, and the Russians begin a war where they guerrilla attack and take them, and it makes things almost impossible to move. The stories are really rough. Napoleon's army is unprepared for the winter, and they don't have the right equipment. They don't have equipment and gear, more or less the same thing. They don't have food, etc., etc. There are stories of frostbite and hypothermia. There are stories of people getting so frozen and cold that they rub their eyelids, and the eyelid just kind of wipes away like it's a piece of paper or something along those lines because it's so cold and frozen off, stuff like that. Napoleon takes about 350,000 troops into Russia, and depending on the sources you read, between 10,000 and 35,000 make it back alive. Okay, that's less than 10%, and at this point those numbers are absolutely staggering. Okay, at this point point at this time, you're looking at like huge and I'm talking like massive casualty numbers would be like if you lost like 20 to 25%. We talked about that in the 30 Years' War. You know, the U.S. Civil War, we hit like 33% casualties. Those are staggeringly massive casualty numbers. This is Napoleon's army at least 90% crushed, which is just the end of it right here. And at this point, everybody begins to turn on him. Britain now allies with Russia and Prussia and Austria. Austria and Prussia had been on the same side with Napoleon, but they're kind of like, you know what, we never liked you anyway, we're only doing this so that you didn't get our butts kicked entirely. And they all ally together to maintain the balance of power. And this sends nationalism way up because all these countries now fighting each other, all of them want to be more powerful, nobody can get more powerful. The French do what's in the best interest of the French, the Prussians do what's in the best interest of the Prussians, etc., blah, 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 blah. And this will be true like for an extended period of time as they now try to talk. It really kind of sows the seeds of discontent, like, you know, first being with Napoleon, then not being with Napoleon, then Napoleon trying to conquer Europe, all these things, etc., etc. Trapped and almost beaten at Leipzig, the Allies begin to invade France, and they eventually capture Napoleon, and they send him to the Isle of Elba, okay? They send him into exile in the island. Okay, and this gives you an idea of the map right here. You've got the French Empire here. You've got things controlled by France in lighter blue. You've got what were allies like Austria, Prussia, etc., that are going to turn on him. Then you've got in the green, which is Russia, and then you see him turn on him, etc., on down. And if you look right near Corsica, you'll see this small little island right here named Elba. And what they do is they don't want to kill Napoleon because he's so popular in France, and they're afraid that they will have a massive French, like, revolution riot. I mean, there's everything going crazy on their hands, etc., etc. So they take Napoleon and they put him on this island of Elba, and they're like, Napoleon, you can basically chill here. While they're doing this, this Austrian diplomat and noble by the name of Clemens von Metternich calls together something called the Congress of Vienna. Okay, and the Congress of Vienna is a meeting between the Big Five. This is England, France, Prussia, Russia, and Austria-Hungary. And for the next 100 years of European history, those are going to be the most important players by far. We'll talk about the Big Five. I'm not saying you need to memorize them hardcore. You'll probably learn them naturally, but it's England, France, Prussia, which is going to be eventually Germany, but for now it's Prussia, Russia, and then Austria-Hungary. Okay, and the goal here is to have a super conservative meeting and restore Europe to normal, quote unquote. Okay, this is not about creating European democracy. This is about how do we make sure that we can put like monarchies back on the throne, have old school Europe go back to the hierarchy, etc., in this thing. This also begins the great European tradition of sitting down with a bunch of countries and a map that aren't there and dividing up and drawing the map without any say-so in those countries. If you remember the scramble for Africa, you remember they did it hardcore there. But they actually do it to themselves and other Europeans on a number of different occasions. This is just a grand European tradition here. We're going to divide up the map without everybody getting a say, especially those who actually live where we are. Meanwhile, Napoleon's, as I said, gone into exile. He's on the island off the coast of Elba. And actually, they're like, you know what, Napoleon, you know what, while you're on Elba, do what you want to do. Play emperor, like, knock stuff out. Like, actually, Napoleon, like, builds a school system, he builds a mail system, he organizes the town a little bit, he gets things down. Like, they're like, you know what, Napoleon, if you will just chill here, you can do whatever you want on Elba. And things are working out fairly well. With Napoleon, like, not trying to revolt or do anything like that. Like, as I said, he's basically the mayor of Elba. But it starts to get word that the Congress of Vienna has restored Louis XVI's brother, who's now become Louis XVIII. Okay, his son was Louis XVII, and he died in jail, so this is Louis XVIII. He's restored him to the monarchy, and he started to undo a lot of the forms of revolution, and he's become very, very, very unpopular. And so, long story short, Napoleon eventually busts off Elba. Okay, and he marches all the way from Elba up through Italy, up through France, in what's known as the 100 Days. Crowds cheer him, like he lands at Marseille, and like, you know, the king's troops begin to desert him and follow him up, and he walks to Paris, and he's just got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people following him. And for 100 days, like, France's glory is restored, and like Napoleon is emperor once again. Okay, the Allies quickly get their armies back together, led by the British general, the Duke of Wellington. They amassed troops at a place in modern-day Belgium known as Waterloo. You might have heard of that before. Waterloo is going to be, in fact, Napoleon's Waterloo. Waterloo has gotten to be, that's my point, such a big battle that we now use it as a lowercase, non-proper noun, to describe, like, somebody's, like, you know, last major event or so. That becomes their Waterloo. So Waterloo was Napoleon's Waterloo. All right, I'll stop making corny dad jokes now. Anyway, The French are fighting okay for a bit until the Prussians arrive and the French troops collapse. Napoleon surrenders. This is the end of the French Empire. The Congress of Vienna will continue. They will divide up Europe in a way that surprisingly does not cripple France, but does maintain the balance of power. Napoleon is going to be sent to a place called St. Helena. It's actually the Allies sit down and they're like, "What's the single crappiest place in the entire world we can think of?" And they find this volcanic rock off the coast of Africa in the South Atlantic. It's such a POS that like when Napoleon's wife gets there, she actually just breaks down in tears, like looking at it. And basically, he writes his memoirs and dies there in 1821. And this kind of wraps up all the events of like Napoleon and the various transatlantic revolutions that went on. The question I'd have you guys think about and that we'll talk about in class is what, if anything, actually changed? And of those changes, like what new world are we going into in like the 19th century that Europe's going to have to deal with? And that's what we're going to, and Latin America. That's what we're going to spend like the next unit looking at is industrialism, liberalism, and then conservatism in Latin America, and various other like types of isms as we kind of explore these in the 19th century. So this wraps up Napoleon for me, y'all. Check out the stuff that I posted with the in-class stuff we did on Canvas, and let us know if you have any questions, and I will talk to y'all soon.